Sometimes the worst thing you can do isn't making a mistake. It's staying quiet when it wasn't yours to carry. The glass slipped before I even realized my fingers had lost their grip. Crystal hitting marble with a sharp crack that echoed louder than it should have, louder than a simple accident deserved. And for a second, everything froze. Every conversation, every laugh, every clink of silverware suspended in the heavy air of the restaurant. And then all at once the sound came rushing back, but not for me, never for me, because I was already on my knees, heart racing, hands trembling as I reached for the scattered shards, ignoring the sting when one edge caught my palm, ignoring the warmth that followed, because pain was easier than what came next, easier than the voice that cut through the room like it had been waiting for this exact moment. "What do you think you're doing?" Mr. Dalton didn't yell, not at first, and somehow that was worse, his voice low, controlled, the kind that made everyone nearby pretend not to listen while hearing every word. "I'm sorry," I whispered, the words automatic, practiced, even though I knew, God, I knew, that tray hadn't been mine, that the order had been rushed, switched, mishandled before it ever reached my hands. But correcting him meant pointing fingers, and pointing fingers meant problems I couldn't afford, so I lowered my head and took it, just like I always did. "Sorry doesn't replace a $200 glass," he said, louder now, enough for the nearby tables to notice, enough for the embarrassment to settle under my skin like a slow burn. "It won't happen again," I added quickly, swallowing the truth before it could rise, because rent didn't care about fairness, because my little brother's school fees didn't pause for justice, because sometimes silence was cheaper than honesty, and I could feel it then, that familiar weight, pressing down on my chest, the quiet acceptance that this was just how things worked, until something shifted, subtle but undeniable, like the air itself had changed direction, and I felt it before I saw him, that awareness crawling up my spine, making the fine hairs on my arms stand on end. And when I finally looked up, it wasn't at Mr. Dalton, it was past him, past the polished tables and dim lighting, straight to the corner where the shadows felt heavier, where a man sat like he owned more than just the room, more than just the building, maybe more than the entire block, his suit dark, perfectly tailored, his posture relaxed in a way that didn't ask for attention but commanded it anyway, and his eyes, steady, unreadable, locked on me like I was the only thing in focus in a blurred-out world, and I didn't know why that unsettled me more than the shouting, more than the threat of losing my job, because he hadn't said a word, hadn't moved, hadn't done anything except watch, but it felt like he'd already seen everything, like he'd watched the tray change hands, watched the hesitation in my shoulders, watched the moment I chose to take the blame, and for a second, just a second, I wondered what he saw when he looked at me, because it didn't feel like judgment, didn't feel like pity, it felt like calculation, like I was a piece on a board I didn't know I was part of. "Clean it up," Mr. Dalton snapped, breaking whatever invisible thread had stretched across the room, and I nodded quickly, forcing my gaze away, forcing myself back into motion, back into the version of me that kept my head down and my voice low, because that was safe, because that was manageable, because men like him didn't notice girls like me. Not really, not in any way that changed anything. And yet as I stood, carefully gathering the broken pieces into my shaking hands, I felt it again, that weight of his attention, steady, unrelenting, and something deep in my chest tightened, not fear exactly, not hope either, something in between, something dangerous, because for the first time that night, the mistake didn't feel like the worst part anymore, being seen did. I told myself not to look at him again, not to give that strange pull any more space in my head, but it was impossible to ignore the way the room seemed to orbit around his table, like even the noise bent itself to keep a respectful distance, and I focused instead on the task in front of me, on stacking the broken glass carefully onto the tray, on keeping my hands steady even as the small cut in my palm throbbed with each movement, a quiet reminder that I had chosen this, that I had stayed silent, that I had taken something that was never mine to carry, and maybe that was what I deserved. Maybe that was the cost of keeping everything else in my life from falling apart. "You are still standing there." Mr. Dalton's voice came again, sharper now, impatient. "Table 7 is waiting." And I nodded quickly, rising to my feet, wiping my hand discreetly against the side of my apron, hoping the stain would not be noticed, hoping nothing about me would stand out again tonight. Because attention had a way of turning into trouble, and I had learned that lesson too many times to count. But as I turned, tray balanced carefully in my hands. I felt it again, that same gaze, heavier now, closer somehow, like distance did not matter to him the way it did to everyone else. And before I could stop myself, I glanced up, just for a second, just enough to confirm what I already knew. He was still watching, still completely still, his expression unreadable, but there was something different now, something sharper, like he had moved past observing and into deciding. And that realization sent a ripple of unease through me that I could not explain, because men like him did not notice accidents. They did not care about waitresses or broken glasses or quiet apologies. They existed in a different world entirely, one where mistakes were handled differently, where silence was not something you chose but something that was enforced. And yet he had seen me, really seen me, in a way that felt like being pulled out of the background and placed under a spotlight I never asked for. And I forced myself to look away again, to walk, to move, to keep going like nothing had changed, because that was how you survived. You kept your head down, you finished your shift, you went home, and you pretended that moments like this did not mean anything. But my steps felt different now, slightly unsteady, like I was walking into something I could not yet see. And when I reached table 7, I recited the specials automatically, my voice steady even as my thoughts were not. Even as part of me remained aware of him, tracking the room without looking, measuring the distance, counting the seconds, until I felt it, a presence beside me, close enough that the air shifted again, close enough that I did not need to turn to know it was him. "You are going to need a bandage," he said, his voice low, calm, not loud enough for anyone else to hear, but clear enough that every word settled exactly where it was meant to. And I froze for half a second, my breath catching before I could stop it, because I had not noticed him approach, had not heard his footsteps, had not seen him leave his table. And that alone told me everything I needed to know about the kind of man he was, the kind who did not announce himself, who did not need to. And slowly, carefully, I turned my head just enough to meet his gaze, and up close, it was worse, or maybe clearer, his eyes steady, focused, not on the tray, not on the customers waiting, but on my hand, on the thin line of red I had tried so hard to hide. "It is nothing," I said quickly, pulling my hand back slightly, instinctively creating space, because whatever this was, whatever he wanted, I could not afford to be part of it. "It will stop," I added, quieter now, more to convince myself than him. But he did not move, did not step back, did not look away. "It already should have," he replied, and there was something in the way he said it, something final, like he was not talking about the cut at all, and my heart stuttered in my chest, because suddenly it did not feel like a conversation anymore. It felt like the beginning of something I had no control over, and I realized then, standing there with a tray in my hands and his attention fixed entirely on me, that staying quiet had never really been the end of the story. It had just been the part where he started paying attention. My first instinct was to step back, to put distance between us before whatever this was could take shape, but my feet did not move. And that scared me more than his presence ever could, because I was not the kind of person who froze. I was the kind who adapted, who adjusted, who survived by staying one step ahead. And yet here I was, standing still while a man I did not know looked at me like he had already made a decision about something I had not even realized was a choice. "I said it is nothing," I repeated, more firmly this time, forcing my voice to stay even, forcing my hand to lower back to my side as if the cut had never existed, as if his attention had not found it so easily. But he did not react the way people usually did when you pushed them away. He did not insist, did not argue, did not soften. He simply watched, and that silence stretched just long enough to make me uncomfortable, just long enough to make me aware of how close he was, how easily he had stepped into my space without asking, and how the rest of the room seemed to blur at the edges because of it. "You covered for someone," he said finally, and the words landed with a weight that made my stomach tighten, because it was not a question, not even close. It was a statement, calm and certain, like he had been there the entire time, like he had seen every second of it unfold. And for a moment I forgot how to respond, forgot how to deflect, because no one ever said that out loud. No one ever called it what it was. They just accepted the version that was easier, the version that did not disrupt anything. And I felt that familiar instinct rise again, the one that told me to deny, to dismiss, to keep everything contained. I do not know what you mean, I said, keeping my eyes on his but pulling every wall I had built into place behind them, because admitting it would not change anything. It would not fix the broken glass or the manager or the situation I was in. It would only make things more complicated, and complicated was dangerous when you live paycheck to paycheck. But something shifted in his expression then, not frustration, not disbelief. Something quieter, almost like acknowledgement, like he expected that answer and had already accounted for it. Of course you do not, he replied, and there was no edge to it, no judgment, just a simple acceptance that made it harder to push back against, because he was not trying to prove me wrong. He was simply stating what he already knew, and that unsettled me more than anything else, because it meant I was not controlling this interaction the way I thought I was. You should be more careful with what you take responsibility for, he added, his voice dropping slightly, not threatening, not warning, just certain, and I felt something tighten in my chest at that, something that felt dangerously close to being understood, which was not something I was used to, not something I knew how to handle, because being understood meant being seen, and being seen meant being exposed, and exposed meant vulnerable, and vulnerable was the one thing I had spent years avoiding. I am careful, I said quickly, almost automatically, because that was what I told myself every day, that I was careful with my choices, careful with my words, careful with the way I moved through the world so nothing could knock me off balance. But the second the words left my mouth, I knew he did not believe them, not because he disagreed, but because he had already seen the truth, and that made my carefully built control feel thinner than it ever had before. No, he said quietly, and it was the first time there was any real weight in his voice, not loud, not harsh, but firm in a way that left no room for argument. You are quiet, not careful. And the distinction hit harder than I expected, because it was so precise, so accurate it made something in me flinch before I could stop it. And I hated that he could do that, hated that he could reduce something I had relied on for so long into something so simple, so incomplete. And I straightened slightly, forcing my shoulders back, forcing my expression to stay neutral. I need to get back to work, I said, because this conversation was going somewhere I did not want it to go. Because the longer I stood here, the more it felt like I was stepping into something that would not let me walk away the same. And for a second, I thought he might stop me, might say something else, might push further, but instead, he stepped back, just enough to give me space, just enough to make it look like he had never taken it in the first place. Finish your shift, he said, and there was something final in it, something that felt less like permission and more like a decision already made. We will talk after, and my breath caught before I could stop it, because he did not ask if I wanted to, did not wait for me to agree. He simply stated it like it was inevitable, like whatever came next had already been set in motion. And as I turned away, forcing myself to move, forcing my legs to carry me back into the noise and motion of the restaurant, one thought settled heavily in my mind, louder than anything else around me. I had not just been noticed, I had been chosen. I told myself I would leave the second my shift ended, that I would not wait, would not look back, would not give him the chance to turn a statement into something real. But the hours moved differently after that, slower and sharper at the same time, every minute stretching just enough to make me aware of it, every task feeling heavier, because I could not stop thinking about what he had said, about the certainty in his voice, about the way he had already decided there would be an after, and no matter how many tables I cleared or orders I memorized, that thought stayed with me, steady and persistent, like a clock counting down to something I did not agree to but could not seem to avoid. And I made a point not to look in his direction again, not even once, because I knew if I did, it would only make it harder to pretend this was nothing, harder to convince myself that I could still walk away untouched. But awareness does not need sight, and I could feel it anyway, that quiet presence, that unspoken attention that followed me through the room without ever needing to move, until finally the night began to wind down. The crowd thinning, the noise fading into something softer, more manageable, and when I stepped into the back hallway to grab my things, the sudden quiet felt almost too loud, the hum of the fluorescent lights replacing the chaos of the dining floor, and I let out a breath I had not realized I had been holding. my shoulders, dropping slightly as I leaned against the cool wall for just a second, just long enough to remind myself that this was still my life, still my space, still something I controlled. And then the door behind me opened, slow and deliberate, and I did not need to turn to know it was him. "You were going to leave without saying anything," he said, not accusing, not surprised, just stating a fact the same way he always did, like there were no other possible outcomes except the ones he had already considered. And I closed my eyes briefly before pushing myself upright, turning to face him because ignoring him now would only make things worse, because people like him did not disappear when you pretended they were not there. They waited, and waiting gave them more control, not less. "I finished my shift," I said evenly, gripping the strap of my bag a little tighter than necessary, grounding myself in something familiar, something mine. "I am going home." And for a second, neither of us moved, the narrow hallway suddenly feeling even smaller with him in it, his presence filling the space in a way that made it impossible to think of anything else. "No," he said quietly, and that single word stopped me more effectively than anything louder ever could, because it was not forceful, not aggressive. It was simply absolute, and I felt something inside me push back immediately, instinct rising to the surface before I could stop it. "You do not get to decide that," I replied, my voice sharper now, steadier, because this was familiar ground. This was where I knew how to stand my own, where I knew how to draw lines and hold them. But he did not react the way I expected, did not challenge me, did not step closer. He just watched, that same calm, controlled focus settling over me like a weight. "I already did," he said, and there was no arrogance in it, no need to prove anything, just quiet certainty that made my pulse pick up despite myself, because it felt real in a way I did not want it to. And I shook my head slightly, refusing to let that settle, refusing to let him rewrite the situation so easily. "I did not ask for your help," I said, each word deliberate, measured, because if this was about what happened earlier, if this was about him stepping in where he thought I needed it, then I needed him to understand that I had made my choice, that I was fine with it, that I could handle my own consequences. But something shifted in his expression then, not irritation, not dismissal, something deeper, like he was looking past the words and straight at the reason behind them. "That is the problem," he said, and this time there was something in his voice that made my breath catch, not fear, not exactly, something heavier, something that felt like truth I had been avoiding. "You think asking is what matters," he continued, his gaze steady, unrelenting. "It is not." And the way he said it made the hallway feel even quieter, like the world outside it had faded completely, leaving just the two of us and the weight of something I did not fully understand yet. "Then what does matter?" I asked before I could stop myself, the question slipping out because I needed to know. Because if he was going to step into my life like this, if he was going to act like he had a say in things that had nothing to do with him, then I needed to understand why. Needed to find the edge of whatever this was so I could stay on the right side of it. And for a moment, he just looked at me, like he was measuring something I could not see, deciding something I was not part of. And when he finally spoke, his voice was softer, but somehow more final than anything he had said before. "What matters," he said slowly, "is that you should not have had to carry that alone." And the words landed differently than I expected, not like a promise, not like an offer, but like a statement of fact that changed something fundamental in the air between us. And for the first time that night, I did not know how to respond, because no one had ever said that to me before. No one had ever made it sound like what I carried was not just part of who I was supposed to be, and that uncertainty settled deep in my chest, quiet but impossible to ignore, because somewhere between the broken glass and this narrow hallway, the rules I had been living by no longer felt as solid as they used to be. I did not answer him right away, because I did not know how to, because his words did not fit anywhere in the life I had built for myself, a life where you handled things quietly, where you did not expect anyone to step in, where you learned early that carrying things alone was not just normal, it was necessary. And yet the way he said it made it sound like something had been taken from me instead of something I had chosen, and that unsettled me more than anything else he had said tonight. "It was not a big deal," I finally replied, my voice softer now, but still steady, still holding on to the version of reality that made sense to me. Because if I admitted it mattered, if I admitted it should not have happened, then I would have to question everything else I had accepted without hesitation, and I was not ready to do that. Not here, not with him, not in a hallway that suddenly felt too small for the conversation we were having. But he did not argue, did not correct me. He just watched. That same quiet focus settling over me like he was waiting, not for me to change my mind, but for me to understand something on my own, and that patience made me more uneasy than pressure ever could, because it meant he was not trying to force anything. He was simply certain it would happen eventually. "You think that because you are used to it," he said after a moment, his voice calm, measured, like he was stating something simple and obvious, and I felt my jaw tighten slightly at that. Because I did not like being read this easily, did not like the way he seemed to peel back layers I had spent years reinforcing. "And you think you know me?" I asked, a hint of challenge slipping into my tone before I could stop it, because if he was going to stand here and dissect my choices like they were predictable, then I needed to push back, needed to remind both of us that I was not something he could just figure out in a few minutes of observation. But instead of reacting, instead of rising to it, he tilted his head slightly, considering me in a way that felt less like judgment and more like confirmation. "I know enough," he replied, and the simplicity of it caught me off guard, because there was no need for him to prove anything, no need to list details or justify his statement. He just said it like it was already settled, and that made it harder to argue against, because I could feel it too, that uncomfortable truth sitting just beneath the surface, the one that said he had seen something real, something I had not meant to show. And for a moment neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us again, but this time it felt different, heavier, like it was holding something unspoken that neither of us had fully addressed yet, until he reached into his jacket pocket, the movement slow, deliberate, and pulled out a small, neatly wrapped bandage, holding it out toward me without stepping closer, without crossing that invisible line I had tried to maintain. "Take it," he said simply, and I hesitated, my eyes flicking from the bandage to his face and back again, because this was not about the cut, not really. It was about what accepting it meant, about what it said if I let him fix something I had already decided to ignore, and I felt that instinct rise again, the one that told me to refuse, to keep control, to not let anyone else take over something that was mine to handle. But my hand moved before my mind could fully catch up, fingers brushing lightly against his as I took it, the contact brief, but enough to send a strange awareness through me that I could not explain, and I quickly pulled back, focusing instead on unwrapping it, on pressing it gently over the small cut as if that was the only thing that mattered, as if this was just a practical moment and not something that carried more weight than it should. "Thank you," I said quietly, the words unfamiliar on my tongue in this context, because gratitude was easy when it was expected, when it followed clear lines and simple exchanges, but this felt different, less defined, and that made it harder to place, harder to accept without question. And when I looked up again, he was still watching me, but something in his expression had shifted, not softened, not exactly, but changed in a way that made the air between us feel less tense, less like a standoff and more like something else entirely, something I could not quite name yet. "You should not have said that," he said after a moment, and I blinked, confused by the statement, by the way it did not match anything I had just done. "Said what?" I asked, my voice quieter now, more cautious, because every time he spoke, it felt like the ground shifted slightly beneath me, like I was standing in a place that looked familiar but was not as stable as I thought, and his gaze held mine steadily as he answered, his voice low, certain, leaving no room for misunderstanding. "That it was not a big deal," he said, and something in my chest tightened again, that same unfamiliar pressure building where certainty used to be. "Because it was," he added, just as simply, and this time there was no space to dismiss it, no easy way to push it aside, because he did not say it like an opinion, he said it like a fact, and for the first time, I felt something shift inside me, small but undeniable, like a crack forming in something I had always believed was solid, and I realized then, standing there with a bandage in my hand and his words settling deeper than I wanted them to, that maybe the mistake had never really been the glass, maybe it had been everything I had been willing to accept before it. The word stayed with me longer than it should have, echoing quietly in the back of my mind as I stepped out into the cool night air, the city wrapping around me in familiar sounds and distant lights, cars passing, voices blending into a low hum that usually grounded me, usually reminded me that everything was still the same, still predictable. But tonight it felt different, like something had shifted just enough to make everything slightly off balance, and I tightened my jacket around me as I walked down the sidewalk, my steps quick, purposeful, like I could outpace the feeling if I moved fast enough, like distance could undo whatever had just happened in that hallway. But it did not work, because his voice was still there, steady and certain, cutting through every distraction I tried to throw in its way, because it was, and I exhaled sharply, shaking my head slightly as if that could push the thought away, because I had heard things like that before, in different ways, from different people, promises that something mattered, that I deserved more, that things should be different. But words were easy. Words did not change the reality waiting for me at the end of the block, the small apartment. The bills stacked neatly on the counter, the responsibility that did not pause. Just because someone decided I should not have to carry it alone. And that was what he did not understand, or maybe what I refused to believe he understood, because if he did, then his certainty meant something else entirely, something I was not ready to face, and I slowed as I reached the crosswalk, the red light holding me in place as I stared out at the traffic moving past, headlights streaking through the dark like lines I could not cross. Not yet, and I pressed my thumb lightly against the bandage, feeling the slight pressure, the reminder that something small had already been changed without my permission, and that thought unsettled me more than anything else, because I had accepted it, had taken it without argument, had let him step in for a moment without pushing him away, and that was not like me, not the version of me I relied on to stay steady, to stay in control, and I frowned slightly, trying to make sense of it, trying to find the exact moment where I had allowed that shift to happen. But before I could, the light changed, the signal flashing white, and I stepped forward automatically, crossing with the crowd, blending back into the flow of people moving through their own routines, their own quiet battles, and for a second, it almost worked, almost made everything feel normal again, until I heard it, the low rumble of an engine pulling up beside me, smooth and controlled, not rushed, not careless, just precise, and I did not need to look to know it was not random, did not need to turn to feel that same awareness settle over me again, heavier now, because I was no longer inside the boundaries of the restaurant, no longer in a space where I understood the rules. And I slowed slightly, my steps faltering just enough to acknowledge what I already knew, that whatever had started back there had not ended when I walked out. And I turned my head slowly, just enough to confirm it, the dark car moving alongside the curb, its windows tinted but not completely, just enough to obscure without hiding. And when the passenger side window lowered, it was him, exactly as composed as before, exactly as certain, like the space between us had never existed at all. "Get in," he said, his voice calm. Like this was the most natural next step, like this was not an interruption but a continuation, and I stopped completely this time. The movement around me continuing while I stood still, caught between instinct and something else I could not yet define, because everything in me told me to refuse, to step back, to keep walking and leave this behind before it could become something I could not control. But there was another part, quieter but just as persistent, the part that remembered his words. The way he had looked at me like I was not invisible, like what happened mattered even when I tried to dismiss it. And I swallowed slowly, forcing myself to meet his gaze fully, not just glance, not just confirm, but really look. And there it was again, that same unwavering focus, not demanding, not impatient, just waiting, like he already knew the answer even if I had not said it yet. "I told you," I said, my voice steady but softer than I intended. "I am going home." And for a second, nothing changed, the car idling, the city moving, the moment stretching just long enough to make me question whether I had imagined everything before, whether this was just another encounter that would fade into nothing, until he spoke again, just as simply, just as certain, "So am I." And something about the way he said it made the distance between those words and what they meant feel very, very small. I should have laughed, should have shaken my head and kept walking, because people did not just appear beside you like this and decide they were part of your night, your route, your life, but the words settled differently than they should have, quieter, heavier, like they carried something underneath them that I could not ignore no matter how much I wanted to. and I stayed where I was for a second longer than necessary. Long enough for the moment to become real, long enough for the choice to stop feeling simple. Because it was simple. It should have been. You say no. You walk away. You do not get into cars with men you met an hour ago. Especially not men who move through the world like rules are suggestions instead of boundaries. And yet my feet did not move. And that alone told me this was already more complicated than I wanted it to be. That is not funny. I said finally, my voice quieter now, not sharp like before, not defensive, just steady, because I needed to hold on to something that felt like control, even if it was only in the way I spoke. But he did not smile, did not react like I had made a joke. He just watched me with that same calm focus, like he was waiting for me to reach the same conclusion he already had, and that unsettled me. More than anything else, because it meant he was not trying to convince me. He was simply letting me decide, and somehow that made it harder to refuse, not easier. It is not, he replied, just as evenly, and the engine idled quietly beside us, the soft hum blending into the background noise of the street, but everything else felt distant, like the world had narrowed down to this one moment, this one decision. And I exhaled slowly, glancing down the block toward my apartment, the familiar path, suddenly feeling farther away than it ever had before, because I knew if I kept walking, if I chose that direction, everything would stay the same, predictable, manageable, and there was comfort in that, safety in knowing exactly what came next. But there was also something else now, something I could not ignore, something that had started the moment he looked at me like I was not invisible, like what I did mattered even when I tried to make it smaller, and I hated that it made me hesitate. Hated that it made me question something I had never questioned before, because hesitation was a crack, and cracks had a way of spreading if you did not seal them quickly. I do not know you, I said, turning back to him, meeting his gaze fully again, because if this was going to happen, if I was even going to consider it, then I needed to be clear about that, needed to draw some kind of line even if it was already shifting beneath me. And for a second, something almost like acknowledgement passed through his expression. Not agreement, not reassurance, just recognition of the truth in what I said. You will, he answered, and there it was again, that certainty, that quiet confidence that did not push but did not retreat either, and my pulse picked up slightly at the simplicity of it, because it was not a promise, not a threat, just a statement that felt like it was already in motion, like the outcome had been decided somewhere I could not see. And I hesitated one more time, just long enough to feel the weight of both choices pressing in on me, the safe one and the uncertain one, the life I understood and whatever this was beginning to become. And then, before I could think about it too much, before I could talk myself out of it or rationalize it into something smaller, I moved, stepping closer to the car, the decision settling into place with a quiet finality that made my chest tighten slightly, and I reached for the handle, pausing for just a fraction of a second as one last thought crossed my mind, clear and sharp. This was the moment everything could still stay the same. And then I opened the door anyway, sliding into the passenger seat. The interior quiet and controlled, everything in its place, just like him. And as the door closed behind me, cutting off the noise of the street, I realized something I had not fully understood until now. I had not gotten into the car because he told me to. I had gotten in because a part of me wanted to know what would happen if I did. The door closed with a soft, final sound that felt louder than it should have, like it marked something more than just the end of the street noise, like it sealed a decision I could not take back as easily as I had made it. And for a moment I just sat there, hands resting lightly in my lap, aware of everything and nothing at the same time. The quiet hum of the engine, the faint scent of leather and something clean, expensive but not overwhelming, the kind of detail that did not demand attention but still managed to define the space. And I realized how different it felt from everything I was used to, how controlled it was, how intentional, like nothing here happened by accident. And that thought alone made my chest tighten slightly, because I had stepped into something that operated on rules I did not understand yet. And when I glanced toward him, he had not moved, not immediately, his hands still resting loosely on the steering wheel, his gaze forward for just a second longer before it shifted to me, calm, steady, like he was giving me the space to adjust before anything else happened. And that unexpected pause caught me off guard, because I had braced myself for something more direct, more immediate, but instead there was just silence, deliberate and measured, in it. stretched just long enough to make me aware of my own breathing, of the slight tension still sitting in my shoulders, of the way my fingers curled slightly against my palm where the bandage rested, a small reminder of how this had started. "You are thinking about leaving," he said finally, his voice low but clear, and I blinked, the statement pulling me back from wherever my thoughts had drifted. Because once again he had said something I had not voiced, something I had barely even admitted to myself, and I exhaled slowly, leaning back slightly against the seat as I turned to face him more fully. "You make it sound like I do not have a choice," I replied, and there was a quiet edge to my words. Not sharp, not confrontational, but present enough to hold its ground, because I needed to say it, needed to remind both of us that this was still my decision, that I had stepped into this car on my own, and I could step out just as easily. But he did not argue, did not dismiss it, he just nodded once, like he accepted that part without needing to challenge it. "You always have a choice," he said, and there was something different in his tone now, something steadier, less like a statement and more like a recognition. And for a second, I was not sure what to do with that, because it did not match the certainty he carried in everything else, did not match the way he moved through situations like outcomes were already decided. And that contradiction made me hesitate again, made me question whether I had understood him correctly from the beginning. "Then why does it feel like you already know what I am going to do?" I asked, the question coming out softer than I expected, more curious than defensive, because somewhere between the hallway and this car, something had shifted in the way I responded to him, something I had not fully processed yet, and he studied me for a moment, not rushed, not distracted, like the answer mattered enough to consider carefully before giving it. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter, but somehow more certain than before. "Because you already decided," he said, and the words settled into the space between us with a weight that made my breath catch slightly, because I knew exactly what he meant, knew it in a way that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the moment I opened the door and stepped inside. The moment I chose curiosity over caution, even if I had not fully admitted it to myself at the time. And I looked away for a second, my gaze shifting to the city outside the window, the lights moving past in soft blurs as the car finally began to roll forward, smooth and controlled, like everything else about him. And I felt that same quiet awareness settle in again, the one that told me this was not just a ride home, not just a simple extension of the night. It was something else, something that had already begun before I understood it. And as the car merged into traffic, the familiar streets passing by in a way that felt slightly unfamiliar now, I realized something that made my chest tighten just a little more. I was not thinking about getting out anymore. I was thinking about where this was going, and that was the part that should have scared me the most. The city moved past us in a steady blur of light and shadow, familiar streets stretching out in ways that felt slightly unfamiliar now, like I was seeing them from a distance I had never noticed before, and I kept my gaze on the window longer than necessary, tracking the reflections instead of looking directly at him, because every time I did, it felt like I was stepping deeper into something I did not fully understand yet, and I needed a moment, just a moment, to hold on to something that still felt like mine, something that had not shifted under his quiet certainty. But even in the silence, his presence was impossible to ignore, not overwhelming, not intrusive, just there, steady and constant in a way that made the space feel smaller without ever actually closing in. And I exhaled slowly, letting my head rest lightly against the seat as I finally turned back toward him, because avoiding this was not going to make it disappear. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice calm but more grounded now, less reactive than before, because if I was going to be here, if I was going to follow this moment to wherever it was leading, then I needed to understand at least part of it, needed something concrete to hold on to. And for a second, he did not answer right away, his attention still on the road ahead, hands steady on the wheel like everything about this drive had already been mapped out before I stepped inside. And when he spoke, his tone was the same as it had been all night, measured, certain, like he was giving me exactly as much as I needed and nothing more. "Home," he said simply, and the words settled between us with a weight that felt heavier than it should have, because it sounded like an answer, but it did not feel like one, not entirely. And I frowned slightly, my fingers brushing lightly against the bandage again without thinking, grounding myself in the small physical reminder that something real had happened tonight. something that could not be dismissed as easily as I would have liked. That is not what I meant, I said, and there was a quiet insistence in my voice now, not challenging, but present enough to push for more, because I needed clarity, needed something that made sense in a way I could control. But instead of correcting himself, instead of explaining further, he glanced at me briefly, just long enough for our eyes to meet. And there was something there I had not fully seen before, something deeper than observation or decision, something that felt almost like understanding but sharper, more intentional. "It is," he replied, and that was it. No elaboration, no adjustment, just the same quiet certainty that had followed every word he said tonight. And I felt a flicker of frustration rise in my chest at that. Not because I thought he was wrong, but because I could not prove that he was, because the simplicity of his answer left no room to argue against it. And I looked away again, back to the window, watching as the car slowed slightly. Turning onto a street I recognized immediately, the familiarity hitting me before I could question it, and my breath caught just a little as I sat up straighter, my eyes scanning the passing buildings, the small corner store, the worn sidewalk I walked every day, and then my building came into view, exactly where it always was, unchanged, steady, waiting. And the realization settled in slowly, heavier with each passing second, because this was not coincidence, not chance. He had not guessed, he had known, and I turned back to him quickly, the question already forming before I could stop it. "How do you know where I live?" And this time, there was no softness in my voice, no quiet curiosity, just a clear, direct demand for an answer, because this crossed a line I understood. This stepped into something real in a way I could not ignore, and for the first time since I met him, there was a pause, not long, not uncertain, just enough to acknowledge the shift in the conversation. And when he spoke again, his voice was just as steady as before, but there was something else beneath it now, something that made the air feel heavier, more deliberate. "Because I make it my business to know," he said, and the words landed with a quiet finality that sent a ripple of awareness through me. Because this was no longer just about a broken glass or a quiet choice. This was something bigger, something that had already moved beyond the boundaries I thought I could control. And the car came to a smooth stop in front of my building, the engine idling softly. As everything else seemed to fall away for a second, the city, the noise, the movement, leaving just the two of us and the weight of what he had just said. And I realized then, sitting there with my hand still resting lightly over the bandage and my heart beating just a little faster than it should have, that getting into the car had not been the moment everything changed. It had started long before that. The second he decided I was worth paying attention to, and now, standing at the edge of my own front door, I was no longer sure where his world ended and mine began.